Hello and welcome to day 28 of our daily Bible reading. Today we are looking at Exodus chapters 21 to 22, Psalm 12, and Acts chapter 4. In the book of Exodus, we are coming to a section with a bunch of rules about slavery. Now, these are not things that we refer to much these days, and pretty much all Christian traditions now have rejected and set aside all of the rules about slavery in the Bible. There's roughly 158 different passages that talk about slavery and do not condemn it. And obviously, especially here in the United States, the Bible was used for a long time to justify our slavery practices. But we have come to realize that this is not in line with the teachings of Jesus, and that while there were practices of slavery in the ancient world, it is not something that God condones and wishes to continue in this day. And so the sections on slavery are part of the Bible and is something that we have to wrestle with. And at this point, most of us have agreed to set this aside and to focus on other parts of the teachings of Jesus as having a higher authority and a greater priority in our lives. Now, this interpretation of the Bible, this going back and reviewing and reading it with a new understanding through the lens of the teachings of Jesus, is something that a number of people have also used to apply to the church's practices around the inclusion of LGBTQ people in our communities. There are still many churches that set this group of people aside, but there's a growing number of Christians who believe that we need to treat the handful of verses that talk about homosexuality in much the way that we treat the verses talking about slavery, that they're from a different time and place, that they are not talking about consensual, monogamous, committed relationships between consenting adults, and that based on our experiences today and the instruction of the Holy Spirit in our world today, that we believe that these should also be set aside like the slavery verses so that we can include more people in the life of the church, include more people in the rituals of marriage and ordination. However, this is still an area of great debate within the Christian tradition. So if you are still a traditionalist, I understand where you're coming from, and you are part of a long line of Christians who have held those beliefs. But I want people to know that there is a group of people who are reading these in a different way. And hopefully we can all still continue to be the church together, even if we have different interpretations on these passages. What is the overall message of Jesus as we go through the Gospels and how Jesus interprets the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, for us today? Much of what Jesus talks about focuses on how God is love and God includes all. And even in the Old Testament, we come across passages where God will say, even the Egyptians and Assyrians will become my people someday. God definitely has a bigger plan that is broader than some of our interpretations that have been narrower of some passages. As we go through Exodus, there's a long list of rules. One of the things to look for as you're reading through this section is to look for balance and common sense. There's a lot of things in here that are just guides for ethical behavior. And a lot of it makes a lot of sense to us if we take the time to think it through. The main focus here was, how do we live life together? How do we build up a healthy community that stays connected to God but loves our neighbors as we love ourselves? Verse 31 has a instruction to be holy for my sake, God says. So be holy for God's sake. I think this is an interesting verse for us to think about as we're reading today, and to consider, do our lives reflect God? When people see the choices we're making in our lives, do they see the holiness of God in us? Or are we reflecting the not so holy aspect of life here on earth? Who is the primary influencers in our life, and what do people see when they look at our lives? In Psalm 12, we are reminded that the world is a messy place. In verse 5, God is speaking and says, I've had enough. I'm on my way to heal the ache in the heart of the wretched. Once again, throughout the Old Testament, we see this care and concern that God has for people who are struggling, who are oppressed, who are facing injustice, who are facing crushing poverty or debilitating illnesses of the body and the mind. The question I have when I read this is, at what point have I had enough that I take action? What happens where I start doing something about climate change, where I start doing something about poverty, where I start doing something about the loneliness and mental health of the people around me? Here is God saying, this is a red line. At this point, I have to engage and solve this problem. I think we need to look at our lives and say, where are those red lines in our lives where we say, okay, it's time for me to get involved. It's time for me to do something about this. In Acts 4, there's a different challenge in verse 20. Can we keep silent about what we have seen and heard regarding the truth of Jesus Christ? We hear that Jesus was so compelling that people kept coming back to hear Jesus in the Gospels, to hear about Jesus from the early believers in the book of Acts. What is so compelling about Jesus that we keep coming back? And are we willing to share what God has shared with us? I think a lot of times we just assume that everyone around us knows about Jesus and understands Jesus' teachings, but there's more and more people around us who have not had a very strong tradition with a church or with a regular spiritual life. And we need to realize that we need to take more time to share our knowledge of Jesus with more and more people around us so that the good news, the love and grace that Jesus offers, can be shared with more and more people. We'll see you next time.